The morning the bank froze my checking account, I had $63.18 to my name. By lunchtime, I was sitting in a private conference room beneath 11 brass safe deposit keys, while a bank executive asked me a question that made the back of my neck turn cold. "Mrs. Mercer, why would your late husband leave 11 safe deposit boxes in your name and instruct us not to contact you until someone attempted to close your account?" I stared at him. My husband, Daniel, had been dead for 14 months. He had never mentioned a single safe deposit box, and the only person who had tried to close my account was Daniel's older brother, Richard. At least, that was what the bank's authorization form appeared to say. There were 3 things I could not understand. Why had Daniel hidden the boxes from me? How had Richard obtained a document bearing what looked like my signature? And why, after 31 years of marriage, had my husband arranged for a bank to warn me only after someone tried to erase the last $63 I had left? The bank executive placed a sealed envelope on the table. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Underneath it, he had written 6 words. "Elaine, open box 11 first. Good day, dear listeners. It's Nora again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Elaine Mercer. I was 49 years old when this happened, and I worked as a billing compliance auditor for a hospital system in Columbus, Ohio. It was not glamorous work. Most days, I sat beneath fluorescent lights, reviewing insurance codes, payment adjustments, patient accounts, and error reports. I looked for numbers that did not belong where someone had placed them. A duplicated charge, a missing authorization, a decimal point moved 1 space. People think fraud announces itself with large sums and obvious lies. It usually does not. It begins quietly, inside ordinary paperwork, where everyone assumes someone else has already checked. That was how I approached my work. And, eventually, that was how I approached my marriage. Daniel and I had lived in the same modest brick house for 22 years. We bought it when our daughter, Claire, was still a baby. The kitchen cabinets were dated, the upstairs bathroom faucet leaked in winter, and one of the porch steps dipped slightly on the left side. But it was ours, or I believed it was. Daniel worked as a project manager for a commercial restoration company. He oversaw repairs after fires, floods, and structural failures. He knew how to enter damaged buildings, separate what could be saved from what had been destroyed, and document every loss for insurance companies. He used to say that buildings told the truth if you knew where to look. A water stain showed where the roof had failed. A crack in plaster showed where the foundation had shifted. A door that no longer closed properly meant pressure had moved through the frame. For most of our marriage, Daniel was patient, careful, and dependable. He packed my lunch when I worked late. He called his mother every Sunday. He knew exactly how much cinnamon I liked in my coffee. He was not a man who chased attention. That made the final 2 years of his life harder to understand. He became distracted. Not cruel, not openly secretive, just absent in small ways. He began taking calls in the garage. He changed the password on our home computer. He started keeping his work bag in the trunk of his car instead of beside the kitchen door. When I asked if something was wrong, he always gave me a reasonable answer. A difficult insurance claim, a confidential client, a dispute between contractors. The explanations fit neatly enough, and because I loved him, I did not examine the seams. Then, one rainy Thursday in March, Daniel collapsed at a job site, an undiagnosed aneurysm. There was no warning, no long illness, no chance to say the things people imagine they will say when death gives them time. By the time I reached the hospital, his wedding ring was inside a clear plastic bag. Grief changed the scale of my life. For weeks, I could not understand how the coffee maker continued to turn on at 6 in the morning when Daniel did not, how the mail still arrived, how neighbors still rolled their trash bins to the curb, how people stood in grocery aisles comparing cereal prices while the person who had shared my bed for 3 decades had disappeared. Claire was 28 and living in Chicago. She came home immediately and stayed for 3 weeks. She helped with the funeral, the paperwork, and the silent hours after everyone stopped bringing casseroles. Daniel's will appeared simple. Everything passed to me. The house, his retirement account, his personal belongings. There was no large inheritance, no hidden company, no investment portfolio. At least, that was what I was told. Daniel's brother Richard offered to help with the estate. Richard was 56, polished, soft-spoken, and successful in the way that made other people sit straighter when he entered a room. He owned a regional financial consulting firm and served on 2 nonprofit boards. His suits were understated but expensive. He remembered names. He sent handwritten thank you notes. At the funeral, he held both of my hands and said, "You will not face any of this alone." I believed him. That was my first mistake. Richard recommended Daniel's estate attorney, Martin Voss, to guide me through probate. Martin's office was on the 23rd floor of a glass building, downtown. He spoke in a low, reassuring voice and used phrases like standard procedure and nothing to worry about. He showed me documents. I signed where he placed yellow tabs. I asked questions, but grief had made my thoughts feel wrapped in cotton. Every form looked official. Every explanation sounded ordinary. The house, Martin told me, carried more debt than Daniel had ever admitted. There was a second mortgage, a line of credit, outstanding business obligations Daniel had personally guaranteed. The retirement account had been partially borrowed against. After medical bills, funeral costs, legal fees, and debt payments, very little remained. I was stunned. Daniel had handled most of our long-term finances. I paid utilities, groceries, and daily expenses, but he managed the mortgage and investments. I had trusted the system because I trusted the person maintaining it. In billing, we call that a control weakness. At home, I had called it marriage. Richard offered to purchase the house before the lender foreclosed. "You can remain there for 6 months," he said gently. "That gives you time to decide what comes next." The price was low, but Martin said it was fair considering the liens. I signed. 3 months later, Richard's company owned my home. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment near the hospital. Claire begged me to stay with her in Chicago, but I refused. She had a demanding job, a new marriage, and a life she had worked hard to build. I did not want my grief to become another room in her apartment. I told her I needed routine. That was partly true. The other truth was that I was ashamed. I had spent 26 years auditing financial records, and I had failed to notice my own life collapsing on paper. After Daniel's death, my savings disappeared gradually. Legal fees, moving costs, insurance deductibles, a tax bill Martin said had been overlooked. I sold Daniel's truck. I canceled cable. I stopped buying coffee at work. I learned which grocery store reduced meat after 7 in the evening. 14 months after the funeral, my checking balance fell to $63.18. My paycheck was due the following morning. I had calculated everything carefully. Rent had cleared. The electric bill was scheduled. I had enough for gasoline and groceries until Friday. Then my debit card was declined at a pharmacy. I had gone in to buy blood pressure medication. The cashier tried again. "Sometimes the machine does this," she said kindly. It was not the machine. My banking app displayed one sentence in red: "Account access restricted. Contact your financial institution." I called from the parking lot. After answering security questions, I was transferred twice. Then a woman from the bank's fraud department asked whether I had recently authorized closure of my checking account and transfer of the remaining balance. "No," I said. There was a pause. "Mrs. Mercer, can you come to the downtown branch today? I am at work. It would be best if you came as soon as possible." Something in her voice made me stop asking questions. I told my supervisor I had a banking emergency and drove downtown through light rain. The bank occupied an old limestone building Daniel and I had passed hundreds of times. I had never been inside. My regular branch was near our former home. A security guard checked my identification and escorted me upstairs. That was where I met Jonathan Bell, the bank's senior fiduciary officer. He was a thin man in his early 60s with silver hair and careful manners. A woman from bank security sat beside him. On the table were my account records, the closure authorization, and 11 brass keys arranged in a straight line. Jonathan asked me to confirm my name, address, date of birth, and Daniel's date of death. Then he explained that my checking account had been flagged because someone submitted documents requesting immediate closure. The request included a notarized authorization bearing my signature. It also included a copy of a limited financial power of attorney naming Richard Mercer as my representative. I never signed a power of attorney for Richard. Jonathan turned the document toward me. The signature looked like mine. Not exactly, but close enough to pass if no one examined it carefully. The notary was Martin Voss. I felt the same sensation I experienced at work when two numbers aligned too perfectly. Not certainty, not yet. Just the quiet recognition that something had been made to look routine. Why would closing a checking account lead to those keys? I asked. Jonathan folded his hands. Your husband established a conditional custodial instruction with this institution 3 years before his death. He leased 11 safe deposit boxes under a private trust designation. You were named the successor beneficiary. My mouth went dry. He had an account here? Several. How much money? I cannot discuss the full holdings until identity verification and legal review are complete. The deposit boxes are separate from the accounts. Mr. Mercer instructed us not to notify you immediately upon his death. Why? Jonathan glanced at the security officer before answering. He believed notice might place you at risk. That was when he asked why Daniel would arrange 11 boxes and wait for someone to try to close my account. I had no answer. The envelope lay between us. Elaine opened box 11 first. Jonathan explained that the boxes could not be opened that afternoon. The fraudulent closure request had triggered an internal investigation. The bank's legal department needed to confirm that no probate order restricted access. He gave me copies of the suspicious documents and advised me to obtain independent legal counsel. Not Mr. Voss, he added. It was the first direct warning anyone had given me. I drove back to the hospital but did not go inside. I sat in my car on the 4th level of the parking garage while rain tapped against the windshield. The power of attorney document rested on the passenger seat. My forged signature appeared above a sentence authorizing Richard to access, transfer, close, settle, liquidate, or otherwise control my financial accounts. The language was broad, too broad. I examined the notary date. It was 6 days after Daniel's funeral. I remembered that day. Richard and Martin had come to my house with probate forms. Claire had returned to Chicago the night before. I had slept perhaps 3 hours. Martin placed several documents on the kitchen table. Richard made coffee. I signed forms beside yellow tabs. Had the power of attorney been among them? I could not prove it had not. That frightened me more than a crude forgery would have. A professional fraud is rarely built from nothing. It is built around one piece of truth, one real signature, one legitimate meeting, one moment when the victim was too tired to understand what had been placed in front of her. I called my supervisor and said I would not return that day. Then I drove to a diner across town, where Daniel and I used to eat breakfast on Sundays. I ordered coffee I did not drink. For nearly an hour, I wrote every fact I could remember on a paper placemat. Daniel's private calls, the changed computer password, the work bag in his trunk, the second mortgage, the line of credit, Richard buying the house, Martin notarizing the power of attorney, 11 safe deposit boxes. I drew lines between the facts. Some connected, others did not. The largest question sat in the center. Had Daniel been hiding money from me or protecting it for me? Those were not the same thing. I did not call Richard. I did not call Martin. Fear is strange. It does not always make you small. Sometimes it makes the room very quiet, and in that quiet, you can finally hear what your instincts have been trying to say. I was not brave. I was careful. That evening, I called a woman named Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca had once represented our hospital during a federal billing investigation. She specialized in probate litigation, financial exploitation, and fiduciary misconduct. She was direct, methodical, and almost impossible to intimidate. Her office assistant told me the earliest appointment was the following week. I said, I have 11 undisclosed safe deposit boxes, a forged power of attorney, and an estate attorney who notarized it. Rebecca called me back 12 minutes later. We met the next morning. Her office was above a bookstore in an older building with creaking floors. There were no glass walls or marble tables. Files were stacked in labeled boxes. A yellow legal pad sat squarely in front of each chair. I brought every document I had received after Daniel's death. Rebecca did not begin by offering comfort. She began with dates. When did Daniel die? When did probate open? When did you sign the house transfer? When did Richard take possession? When did you receive the mortgage statements? Who prepared the debt? Summary. Each answer became a note. After 40 minutes, she leaned back. You have 2 separate problems, she said. Possibly 3. I waited. The first is the attempted account takeover. The second is potential fraud in the administration of Daniel's estate. The third is whether assets were intentionally concealed from probate. By Daniel? Perhaps. Or from Daniel. That possibility had not occurred to me. Rebecca explained that a safe deposit box could hold almost anything. Deeds, account records, trust documents, personal letters, evidence of ownership. 11 boxes did not necessarily mean 11 boxes of cash. People who hide money usually consolidate it, she said. People who preserve evidence separate it. The sentence stayed with me. She instructed me not to communicate with Richard or Martin except in writing. She sent the bank a formal representation letter and preservation notice. She also requested the complete probate file, title records for my former house, loan documentation, estate account statements, and copies of every document bearing my signature. Then she gave me a legal pad. Write a timeline, she said. Not what you think happened, only what you can verify happened. That distinction mattered. At work, a suspicion became useful only after it could be tied to a record. I started with bank statements. Daniel and I had received most statements electronically. The old computer had been taken by Richard after the funeral because, he says, it contained company information belonging to Daniel's employer. I had allowed it. Another control weakness, but I still had access to our joint checking history. For 2 years after Daniel's death, there were monthly transfers of $1,850 to an account ending in 4419. The transfer description read MRC Reserve. I assumed it related to the mortgage. Rebecca discovered it did not. The mortgage company had no account ending in those digits. MRC was the abbreviation for Mercer's Restoration Consulting, a company registered by Richard 11 years earlier. Daniel had been transferring household money to his brother's company, or someone using his credentials had. We requested statements for the line of credit supposedly secured by our house. The lender produced an application with Daniel's signature and mine. My signature was false. This time, I knew immediately. The letters were shaped correctly, but the pressure was wrong. I signed my name quickly, with the E and M connected. On the application, the letters were separate. The loan proceeds, nearly $240,000, had not gone into our joint account. They had been wired to an entity called Northvale Holdings. Northvale Holdings shared an office address with Richard's consulting firm. Rebecca hired a forensic document examiner and a forensic accountant. The document examiner compared the loan application to 20 authenticated examples of my signature. Her preliminary opinion was that the loan signature had likely been traced or digitally transferred. The forensic accountant found something more disturbing. Northvale had purchased distressed commercial properties that were later repaired by Daniel's employer. Insurance companies paid for the restoration work. Richard's company arranged financing. Several properties were then resold at substantial profits. Daniel's name appeared nowhere in the ownership records, but his employee credentials, inspection reports, and internal project estimates had been used to select which properties Richard purchased. It looked like Daniel had helped his brother profit from confidential information. I did not want to believe it. Rebecca did not ask me to, she said. We follow the records even when they lead somewhere painful. 5 days after the bank froze my account, we received permission to open Box 11. Rebecca came with me. Jonathan met us in the vault. The room smelled faintly of metal and old paper. The walls were lined with small numbered doors. A bank employee inserted one key. I inserted the other. Box 11 was long and narrow. Inside was a blue accordion folder, a small digital recorder, and another envelope in Daniel's handwriting. I sat at a private viewing table. My fingers shook as I opened the letter Elaine. If you are reading this, I was unable to finish what I started. You may hear that I stole money, hid property, or betrayed you. Some of that will look true because I allowed my name to be used. I believed I could fix the damage quietly. I was wrong. Do not trust Richard. Do not trust Martin Voss. Do not surrender the house without an independent appraisal and title review. Open no other box until you have a lawyer who does not know my family. The accounts and boxes are not an inheritance in the ordinary sense. They contain records. Some money is yours, some belongs to people who were cheated. I am sorry I did not tell you. I thought silence would protect you. It protected them instead. Daniel, I read the letter twice. Then I placed it on the table and stared at the wall. Rebecca did not touch me or offer easy reassurance. She understood that grief sometimes needs space more than comfort. Daniel had known. He had known the house was in danger. He had known Richard and Martin were involved. And still, after his death, I had sat at my kitchen table with both men and signed away my home. The digital recorder contained 6 files. In the first, Daniel described how Richard's scheme began. Years earlier, Richard approached him about identifying undervalued buildings with insurance-covered damage. Daniel believed he was helping legitimate investors purchase and restore neglected properties. At first, the transactions were legal. Then Richard began using confidential repair estimates before insurance settlements became public. Martin created holding companies to conceal ownership. Daniel objected. Richard reminded him that his access had already made earlier deals possible. If the scheme was exposed, Daniel could lose his job and face prosecution. Richard offered a solution. Continue cooperating. Daniel did. That was the betrayal I had not prepared for. My husband was not innocent. He had crossed a line, then allowed fear to carry him farther from it. In the second recording, Daniel admitted he had signed personal guarantees and transferred household money to cover losses when one of Richard's projects failed. He told himself he was protecting me from scandal. Instead, he mortgaged our future without my knowledge. I felt anger rise beneath the grief. Not loud anger, something heavier. Daniel had loved me, but he had not trusted me with the truth. He had treated me like someone who needed protection rather than a partner capable of facing reality. By the fourth recording, his voice had changed. He sounded tired. He explained that he had begun copying documents after discovering Richard and Martin were billing investors for properties they did not fully own. Some funds came from elderly clients who believed they were purchasing secured real estate notes. The notes were not secured. Money from new investors was used to repay earlier ones. Daniel estimated that at least 17 families had been defrauded. He had stored the evidence in separate boxes, so no single person could destroy everything at once. The bank accounts held approximately $1.8 million. My breath caught when Jonathan later confirmed the amount, but Daniel's recording made clear that much of it was not ours. He had diverted money from Richard-controlled accounts into a restitution trust, after obtaining evidence that the funds belonged to Wednesday. Whether that transfer was legally defensible would have to be determined. Box 11 contained the map. Boxes 1 through 10 contained the proof. The next morning, Richard called me. I watched his name appear on my phone and let it ring. He left a voicemail. Elaine, I heard there was confusion at the bank. I wish you had called me. These institutions become overly cautious when someone dies. Let me help you straighten it out. His voice was warm, almost brotherly. Rebecca told me to save the message. An hour later, Martin emailed. He said the bank's concerns likely resulted from a clerical error. He attached a copy of the power of attorney and reminded me that I had signed numerous estate documents while fully informed and competent. That phrase was deliberate. Fully informed and competent. He was building a record before I had accused him of anything. Rebecca replied on my behalf. She requested the original signed document, the notary journal, identification records used at signing, and any correspondence relating to the account closure. Martin did not respond. Instead, Richard arrived at my apartment that evening. He carried a paper bag from the Italian restaurant Daniel and I used to visit on our anniversary. Through the peephole, I saw him standing beneath the hallway light, composed and patient. I did not open the door. Elle, he said softly, I know you're home. Only Daniel had called me Elle. Hearing it from Richard felt like finding someone wearing my husband's coat. I brought dinner, he continued. We should talk before lawyers turn a family misunderstanding into something ugly. I called Rebecca. She told me to keep the door locked and record from inside if state law allowed it. Ohio permitted recording when one party consented. I pressed the record button. What do you want, Richard? I want to protect you. From what? A pause. From information Daniel never intended you to carry. That is not what his letter says. The silence outside my door lasted several seconds. When Richard spoke again, the warmth had thinned. You opened one of the boxes. I said nothing, he continued. Daniel was under enormous pressure near the end. He became paranoid. He copied documents he did not understand. Some of those records involve confidential clients. Possessing them could expose you to serious liability. Then your attorney can discuss that with mine. Rebecca Sloan does not understand the full context. The fact that he knew Rebecca's name told me he had already begun watching the case. Richard lowered his voice. I can arrange a settlement, enough for you to buy another home and retire comfortably. No court, no publicity, no risk to Claire. That was his first direct mistake. What does Claire have to do with this? Nothing, unless people begin examining family finances. Daniel helped with the down payment on her condo, didn't he? Daniel had given Claire $20,000 when she married. Richard was suggesting the money might be connected to fraud. He was not threatening Claire openly. Professional men rarely do. They place danger on the table and let you imagine the rest. I said, please leave. I'll think carefully. I am. I ended the recording. The food remained outside my door until morning. Rebecca sent the audio to the bank's investigators and added it to our evidence file. Then she filed an emergency petition in probate court. The petition asked the judge to reopen Daniel's estate, freeze transfers involving the house, suspend Martin from acting in any fiduciary capacity connected to the estate, and appoint a neutral administrator. Richard's attorneys responded within 48 hours. They claimed I was emotionally unstable, confused by grief, and being manipulated by an aggressive lawyer. They described the power of attorney as valid. They said I had knowingly agreed to sell the house. They accused Daniel of stealing corporate documents and diverting funds. For one night, I wondered whether I should stop. Not because I believed them, because I understood what a public case would cost. My marriage would be examined. Daniel's wrongdoing would become part of the record. Claire might learn things about her father that could never be forgotten. My colleagues might see my name in the news. Richard knew that shame can be more effective than force. He expected me to protect Daniel's reputation. But Daniel's reputation was already being used as a wall behind which other people had hidden. The next morning, I went to work. I reviewed a billing report with 412 line items. At line 206, I found a duplicate payment disguised by a changed service date. The amount was small. The pattern was not. That was when I understood. Truth does not become less necessary because it is embarrassing. I called Rebecca and told her to proceed. Over the next 6 weeks, we opened the remaining boxes under court supervision. Box 1 contained original investor agreements. Box 2 held title reports showing that properties presented as collateral were already encumbered by prior loans. Box 3 contained printed emails between Richard and Martin. Box 4 contained insurance estimates and internal documents from Daniel's employer. Box 5 held notarized statements from 2 former employees of Richard's company. Box 6 contained copies of checks. Box 7 held audio recordings of meetings. Box 8 contained tax records for the holding companies. Box 9 held photographs and property inspection notes. Box 10 contained the original mortgage documents for my house, along with a second deed I had never seen. The second deed transferred our property into a trust controlled by Richard 9 months before Daniel died. My signature had been forged. The later sale I signed, after the funeral, had not transferred the house to Richard for the first time. It had been designed to make an earlier fraudulent transfer appear voluntary. The house had been taken before I knew I was losing it. The strongest evidence was inside Box 7. Daniel had recorded a meeting with Richard and Martin in a restaurant. The audio was imperfect. Plates clinked. Music played in the background, but their voices were clear. Daniel said he wanted out. Richard reminded him that the home equity loan carried both Daniel's and my signatures. Daniel said mine was forged. Martin replied, "For is a conclusion. Documentation is a matter of interpretation." Then Richard said, "Elaine signs what you put in front of her. That has always been the arrangement." I listened to that sentence in Rebecca's office. I did not cry. I wrote down the timestamp. 27 minutes and 14 seconds. That recording changed the case. The bank referred the attempted account closure to federal investigators because the forged documents had been transmitted electronically and involved interstate financial activity. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into the investment scheme. Daniel's former employer cooperated after reviewing the evidence. 3 elderly investors identified Richard as the man who personally assured them their money was secured by real property. 2 had lost most of their retirement savings. The $1.8 million Daniel placed in trust covered only part of the losses. The rest had moved through shell companies, consulting fees, property sales, and accounts held by associates. Richard still tried to settle. His attorneys offered me $750,000, return of the house, and a confidentiality agreement. The offer required me to surrender all claims, return copies of Daniel's recordings, and state that Martin's notarizations had been misunderstood. Rebecca placed the proposal in front of me. "That is enough money to change your life," she said. She was not pressuring me. She was testing whether I understood the choice. "What happens to the investors?" I asked. "They retain their claims, but your cooperation and evidence would become more complicated. What happens to Martin?" "Nothing guaranteed." I looked through the office window at people crossing the street below. For months, everyone had assumed money was the lever that would move me. Daniel hid money to expose the truth. Richard offered money to bury it. But money was not the real weight in the room. The real weight belonged to the people who had trusted professionals with their savings, their homes, and their signatures. "No confidentiality agreement," I said. Rebecca nodded once. "Then we prepare for deposition." Richard's deposition took place in a conference room with no windows. He arrived with 3 attorneys and a public relations advisor. He wore a navy suit and a pale blue tie. He looked rested. For the first hour, he answered calmly. He described Daniel as talented but unstable. He said the business transactions were legitimate. He said Martin handled legal documents. He said he had no knowledge of forged signatures. Then Rebecca began placing exhibits in front of him: the power of attorney, the home equity application, the trust deed, the account closure request. Each contained my signature. Each benefited Richard. Each had been notarized or prepared by Martin. Richard said he relied on counsel. Rebecca introduced an email from Richard to Martin. The subject line was Elaine execution copies. The message read, "Use the clean signature page from the household authorization. She never checks attachments." Richard's expression did not change, but he reached for his water. Rebecca waited until he finished drinking. "What did you mean by clean signature page?" "I do not recall." "What did you mean by she never checks attachments?" "I do not recall the context." Rebecca handed him the transcript from Daniel's restaurant recording. At 27 minutes and 14 seconds, Richard had said that I signed whatever Daniel placed in front of me. He claimed the recording had been altered. A forensic audio expert had already authenticated it. Then, Rebecca produced metadata showing the original file had been created on Daniel's recorder and had not been edited. Richard's attorney requested a break. Rebecca refused until the pending question was answered. "Mr. Mercer, did you submit documents bearing Elaine Mercer's signature knowing she had not signed them?" Richard looked toward his lawyer. His lawyer said, "You may answer." For the first time, Richard's voice lost its smoothness. "I relied on Martin. It was not a confession." But it was the moment the structure shifted. Martin's deposition came 2 weeks later. He invoked his right against self-incrimination 37 times. The notary journal he had been ordered to produce contained missing pages. Bank security footage from the date listed on the power of attorney showed that I had never entered his office. His assistant testified that Martin sometimes asked her to prepare acknowledgement certificates without the signer present. The assistant also produced a backup drive. On it were scanned signature pages from dozens of clients. Mine was in a folder labeled Mercer Reusable Forms. The case moved quickly after that. Federal prosecutors charged Richard with wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, and aggravated identity theft. Martin was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and falsification of notarized instruments. His law license was suspended before the criminal case reached trial. The probate judge voided the fraudulent deed and the post-funeral house sale. the house returned to my name, free of the false trust transfer, though legitimate mortgage debt still had to be resolved. The judge also removed Martin from the estate and appointed a neutral administrator. Daniel's estate was reopened. That process revealed one final truth. Daniel had not created the restitution trust alone. 8 months before his death, he had contacted a former federal investigator named Samuel Ortiz. Daniel had provided preliminary records and agreed to cooperate. Samuel had instructed him to preserve evidence but warned him not to move money without legal authority. Daniel moved it anyway. He feared Richard would empty the accounts before investigators acted. Legally, the transfer was improper. Morally, it preserved funds that would otherwise have disappeared. The court placed the $1.8 million under supervision and created a restitution process for verified victims. After those claims were paid, approximately $310,000 remained attributable to Daniel's legitimate earnings and his share of earlier lawful property investments. That amount passed to me. It was far less than the number people later repeated online. Headlines called it a hidden fortune. They called me the widow with 11 bank boxes. They made it sound like I had opened a metal drawer and become rich. That was not what happened. I opened those boxes and found the collapse of my marriage, the evidence of my husband's fear, and the paperwork of people whose trust had been converted into profit. I also found proof that Daniel had tried, too late and imperfectly, to repair what he had helped damage. Richard eventually pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges after 2 former employees agreed to testify. He received a prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution beyond the funds already recovered. Martin entered a separate plea. He lost his law license permanently and served time in federal custody. Several civil claims continued for years. Justice did not arrive as one dramatic verdict. It arrived in documents, orders, restitution checks, corrected deeds, frozen accounts, signed statements, consequences written in plain language. The truth has a weight of its own. Eventually, even polished people become tired from carrying lies. I did not move back into the brick house. For a while that surprised everyone. Claire asked if I was certain. The court had returned it to me. The fraudulent debt was removed. I could have lived there again, but when I walked through the front door, I did not feel restored. I saw the kitchen table where I had signed papers after Daniel's funeral. I saw the garage where he took private calls. I saw the porch where Richard once promised I would never face anything alone. A house can be legally returned without becoming home again. I sold it to a young couple with 2 small children. I disclosed every repair issue, including the porch step that dipped on the left. With part of the proceeds and a portion of my inheritance, I bought a smaller home outside the city. It had a narrow backyard, an old maple tree, and enough sunlight for a garden. The first spring, I planted tomatoes, lavender, and rosemary. I kept working at the hospital, though I reduced my hours. I began teaching a monthly workshop for widows and older adults about financial records, powers of attorney, beneficiary forms, and common signs of exploitation. I never told people not to trust their families. I told them trust should not eliminate verification. Love is not weakened by transparency. A healthy partnership can survive a question. A healthy professional does not fear a second opinion. Claire struggled with the truth about her father. For several months, she avoided speaking about him. Then one evening, she came to my house carrying Daniel's old toolbox. We sat beneath the maple tree. She said, "I don't know how to remember him now." I told her I did not know either. People like simple categories: good husband, bad brother, victim, criminal. But human beings are rarely built so neatly. Daniel loved us. Daniel lied to me. Daniel helped Richard. Daniel tried to stop him. Daniel protected evidence. Daniel made choices that placed our home and future at risk. All of those things were true at once. Forgiveness did not require me to erase any of them. I told Claire she could remember the father who taught her to ride a bicycle and still be angry at the man who used our family security to cover his fear. Healing, I learned, is not editing the past until it becomes comfortable. It is learning to carry the complete record without allowing it to control every day that follows. 2 years after the case ended, I traveled alone for the first time. Nothing extravagant, I took a train to the coast of Maine and stayed in a small inn where I could hear foghorns at night. One morning, I walked beside the water with a paper cup of coffee warming my hands. No lawyers were calling. No bank accounts were frozen. No one was asking for my signature. I stood there for a long time. I thought about the woman in the pharmacy parking lot whose card had been declined over $63. She believed she had reached the smallest point in her life. She did not know 11 brass keys were waiting beneath a bank. She did not know the last money in her account had been left there intentionally. Jonathan eventually explained that detail. Daniel had instructed the bank to monitor the account I used for daily expenses. He believed Richard would eventually attempt to gain control of it. The $63 did not trigger the warning because of the amount. It triggered the warning because someone tried to remove even that. Richard could not leave a single loose end. That was how the bank knew the danger had reached me. For a long time, I wished Daniel had simply told me the truth while he was alive. I still do. Secrets do not become kindness merely because they were intended as protection. Silence is not the same as safety. But I also understand now that fear had reduced Daniel's world one decision at a time. First, he thought he could manage Richard. Then he thought he could repair the damage. Then he thought he could protect me by keeping me outside it. By the time he understood the truth, he trusted documents more than conversation. So he left me boxes, records, keys, a trail he hoped I would be patient enough to follow. In the end, I did not become rich in the way strangers imagined. I became careful with my name. I became unafraid of asking professionals to explain every page. I became willing to disappoint people who depended on my silence. I became the owner of a small home where no one else controlled the deed. I became a woman who could sit alone beneath a maple tree and feel peaceful rather than abandoned. Money gave me options. Evidence gave me justice, but the truth gave me back to myself. So let me ask you something. What would you have done if the person you loved left behind proof that he had both betrayed you and tried to protect you? Would you have accepted the private settlement and walked away? Or would you have taken the case into court, knowing the truth might change how your family remembered him forever? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you to check a document, ask a question, or trust the quiet warning inside you, please share it with someone who may need that reminder. Because sometimes the smallest number in your account is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the line where the real accounting finally begins.